the phone and bring in Ben Lindbergh. Talk some baseball with Ben. He is a staff writer for Grantland.com and ESPN. He is a former editor-in-chief for Baseball Prospectus. There's a lot going on, Ben, in baseball right now that I think is the subjects are very tantalizing. And I want to start with David Ortiz first, Big Pappy from the Boston Red Sox. He claims he's a Hall of Famer. He doesn't care what anybody says. He doesn't care about the fact that he was named in a PED report in 2004. He doesn't care that no designated hitters, unless you kind of count Frank Thomas, are in the Hall of Fame. He thinks he belongs. Do you, Ben Lindbergh of Grantland.com, believe that David Ortiz belongs in the Hall of Fame?
Well, I wouldn't do a blanket ban for either of the possible reasons to keep him out that you mentioned. I don't have a no DH policy in the Hall of Fame. In my Hall of Fame, I would probably have Edgar Martinez in there. I think you have to debit a guy who didn't play in the field, but, even after you take some runs away because the guy wasn't contributing on that side of the ball, you could still theoretically have a guy who's good enough to get in. And with the PEDs, the evidence that he did something is pretty light compared to most other players, and I'm kind of in the camp that we just have to, accept that was what was going on in that era, and you put the best guys in regardless because it's a museum of baseball history, that sort of thing. That said, David Ortiz didn't have, as long a peak, perhaps, as some guys did. It took him a long time to get started, probably too long, because the Twins didn't know what they had in him. And if you look at the numbers, he probably falls just short of the standards that kind of have been established for, first base / DH types. So I think it kind of comes down to, peak value. How much do you care about the fact that he was a team leader, that he does have a history of, lots of huge hits, big World Series postseason hits? That stuff is hard to value, but the value is obviously very big. So I couldn't really argue with a Red Sox fan who said, this guy's meant so much to the team that it gives him X wins of extra value, because I think he is a little bit short just going purely by stats.
Yeah, if he wants to be in the Hall of Fame, play 5 more years, get your numbers up there. And if you want to be in the Hall of Fame and you're worried about it, quit, so that you can get into that 5-year thing and move on. I just don't know why he's bringing it up at this point. But let's turn to issues that I think are a lot more important. Do you think that the Royals will end up with 47 players in the Major League Baseball AllStar Game? And do you think the rules should be changed? And do you think it's going to have any effect whether there are that many Royals in the AllStar Game?
I do think so, and I have to assume that this is part of some sort of grassroots effort to expose the flaws in the voting process, because it's really kind of incomprehensible that Kansas City and the surrounding areas could have actually outvoted every other city combined in the country. I know Royals fans are enthusiastic about their team, but that is a lot to ask of any fan base. So I have to assume that there are sort of people getting on this bandwagon who don't really like how all-star voting is handled and feel like this would be sort of a, prank, kind of a protest to have Omar Infante starting the All-Star Game. I do think if that happens that we will see some sort of change, and I don't know what it will be, whether it turns out to be player voting or something, which is, something that won't necessarily produce a better team than the process that we've had in the past. But yeah, I have to assume that, if all of these Royals make it, and I know MLB has invalidated some votes, as they always do, and yet it still seems like the Royals are leading in a lot of positions, and a few of those guys really deserve to be there, a few of those guys don't, and I think it probably would be a bit of an embarrassment or a black eye if all of those guys do end up in the starting lineup. They have no choice but to abide by it this year, I suppose, unless they can find more evidence of fraud, but I would think that if that turns out to be the case, that we will see some changes next year.
Ben, can you see Commissioner Manfred doing something similar to what Ford Frick did as commissioner in, I think it was 1957, when all those Cincinnati Reds were voted to the game? Can you see him saying, you know what, Omar Infante of the Kansas City Royals should not be starting at second base for the American League. We're going to put somebody else in there.
I guess you could always exercise that nebulous best interest of baseball clause, right? And, it wouldn't be the worst time to do it, because I think it's clear that, even Royals fans probably wouldn't vote for Omar Infante to start for the Royals at this point, let alone the American League All-Star team. Actually, it's kind of interesting because the Royals have a financial incentive for these guys not to make it, because some of them have All-Star bonuses and clauses that kicked in, and it'll actually cost them some money. So it's possible. I mean, I wouldn't think it would make a mockery of the process or anything, because that is already happening, and it's clear that there are ways to circumvent any sort of restrictions, very light restrictions that are in place to prevent people from voting an unlimited number of times. So if you were to do that, then that would be fine. I guess the question would be how you decide who does make it. You just remove all the Royals and put the second place guy in. It might make a more entertaining game, and people who voted for the Royals as a sort of protest would still probably get their way with some changes to the system going forward.
I like what Ben's saying, that the Royals probably said to some of these guys, "Oh shit, we'll give you $50,000 if you're in the All-Star game.
Sure,
and
Omar.
we'll give you $100,000 if you're
like that's going to happen.
Named President of the United States."
Exactly.
Yeah, and it may be that the agents are behind this. Let me switch gears on you. Speaking of All-Star and festivities, Pete Rose will be involved in that. Is that going to be embarrassing for the city of Cincinnati? Has your opinion of him? You were kind of saying that the Baseball Hall of Fame is a museum, but it's also a centerpiece of supposedly recognizing, and I'm a voter, recognize the greatest players of all time. Unlike when I was on the Hall of Fame for the Pro Football Hall of Fame, you could not and did not take into consideration what happened outside the white lines in football. But in baseball, there is a morals clause. So has it changed your opinion? Do you think it's going to put some cloud over the All-Star game in Cincinnati because he's going to be a part of it? And going forward, do you even believe the Major League Baseball Network should allow him to continue to be a commentator?
Well, he's a commentator on Fox, right?
Fox, I'm sorry. Yeah,
they can do whatever they want to do. But, yeah, I mean, I think the latest revelations probably don't come as a huge shock to anyone. There had been allegations, of course, that he had bet on baseball as a player and as a player manager, and maybe they hadn't been substantiated, but his record of telling the truth is not the strongest. So I don't think it's a shock. The timing is obviously bad for baseball, probably, certainly bad for his case, as it seemed like there was some momentum building towards him possibly being reinstated. He's been out of the game for close to 30 years now. I don't know, I would think that that's probably enough of a disincentive if you're worried about making an example of Pete Rose so that no other player is tempted to bet on baseball. That's a worthy goal. I would think that he's served enough time at this point that it would achieve that purpose already. So I don't know. I am kind of, he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame and part of baseball just in his record as a player. I'd probably consider betting on baseball more serious than taking PEDs, just given, that one was specifically banned at the time and was very much shunned, whereas PEDs during the PED era was going on everywhere and wasn't specifically banned by baseball. So I'd take it a little bit more seriously. I don't think he's really engendered a whole lot of sympathy. It's hard to be a big Pete Rose supporter at this point, I think, but I wouldn't be upset if they relented and let him back in.
He's Ben Lindbergh, and he's a baseball writer for Grantland.com. Actually, he's a general sports writer for Grantland.com who writes a lot about baseball. And all our live guests are brought to you by Papa John's. Better ingredients, better pizza, Papa John's. Ben, last thing. Are we ready to anoint Max Scherzer the best pitcher in baseball? Are we ready to wrest the mantle away from Clayton Kershaw and give it to Max Scherzer at this point?
I would say no. I think you still got to, take into account what those guys have done over the last few years. Scherzer, of course, has been great, but I would still give Kershaw the edge there. 2 months of Scherzer being the best pitcher in baseball, as I believe that he has been so far this year, is probably not enough to change the scales there, but it is incredible what he has done. To this point, he has certainly been the best player in baseball, or best pitcher in baseball, and normally you sign a pitcher or any free agent to a long-term contract, and you just kind of hope that they'll approximate what they were before. You're paying for that past performance, and you're just hoping they won't decline precipitously for a few years, and you'll get some facsimile of what they were in the past. And he has just become better. It's kind of incredible to see what he has done. I mean, having a 2-start stretch that arguably is the best 2-start stretch ever by anyone, and just looking at what he has done over the full season, he's basically Cliff Lee with a 95-mile-per-hour fastball now in terms of his control of the strike zone and his ability to miss bats. He's basically doing it all right now, and he's sort of salvaging the national season, which, given how Rendon has been absent and Strasburg hasn't contributed, things would be looking a lot bleaker if they hadn't signed him, which at the time a lot of people thought was overkill.
Ben, really appreciate your time. People can read Ben at Grantland.com. You got a Twitter handle, Ben?
Ben Lindbergh.
That's easy enough. Thanks, man.
Appreciate you joining us. Yeah.
All right, Ben Lindbergh writes a lot of baseball for Grantland.com, and that was brought to you by Papa John's, the official sponsor of the Colorado